The two orc sisters no longer had the strength to even ask for help after going 5 days without food. Then a lone rancher stopped in front of them and said, "Prepare to come with me." But no one could have imagined what would happen next. The wind didn't ask permission. It cut through the wooden walls of Frost Creek like a blade through cloth, slipping under doors and through cracks that no one had time to seal. Winter had arrived the way it always did in Ashen Plains, without warning and without mercy. The snow had been falling for 2 days straight, covering the roads, silencing the horses, burying the last warmth of autumn under a pale and indifferent white. On a bench in front of the town bakery, 2 young women sat pressed against each other. They had been there since before sunrise. Jenna and Lynn were 23 years old, half orc, born from a human mother and an orc father. Their skin was the color of new leaves, a deep, beautiful emerald that in another life might have drawn admiring eyes. Their ears curved to a soft point. Their features were delicate and high-boned. Even now, even after everything, there was a quiet dignity in the way they held themselves, but their feet were bare against the frozen wood of the bench. Their dresses were thin, patched in too many places to count. The cold had stolen the color from their lips and left their fingers stiff and pale at the tips. Jenna's long chestnut braid was damp from the snow. Lynn's loose waves fell against her shoulders like something exhausted. 5 days. 5 days without a real meal. The small kindnesses from strangers, a half loaf of bread, a cup of broth, had run out 3 days ago. Now there was only the hollow ache that lived behind the ribs and never fully left. The kind of hunger that stopped announcing itself loudly and simply became a part of breathing. Lynn had stopped talking sometime the evening before. Not because she was angry. She simply had no words left. She sat with her knees pressed to her chest and her eyes fixed on the middle distance, watching the snow fall in slow and indifferent silence. Jenna watched her sister and felt the weight of that silence like something physical. She had tried everything she knew how to try. She had asked at the inn, at the feed store, at the stable yard. She had offered to clean, to carry, to mend, to cook. Most people had been polite. A few had been unkind. None of them had said yes. Not to 2 young orc girls with no family, no references, and no last name that meant anything in this town. She reached over and covered Lynn's hand with her own. Lynn didn't pull away. She leaned closer, just slightly, the way she had done since they were children sharing a narrow bed in their parents' small farmhouse, back when the world still made sense, back when their mother used to hum while she cooked and their father used to fall asleep reading contracts by candlelight. Jenna closed her eyes for just a moment. "We are still here," she told herself. "We are still here." The snow kept falling. The morning kept moving around them. Wagons, voices, the smell of bread from inside the bakery that felt like its own kind of cruelty. People passed the bench the way people pass things they have decided not to see. Then the footsteps stopped. Jenna opened her eyes. A man stood in front of them, tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a heavy wool coat darkened with age. His beard was dark brown with threads of grey. His eyes were hazel and quiet, the kind of eyes that had spent years watching the horizon for things that might go wrong. He looked at them both for a long moment. Then he said in a low and even voice, "Prepare to come with me." Nobody moved at first. Jenna stared at the man with the instinct that months of hardship had carved into her, the instinct that said, "Wait, measure, don't trust too quickly." She had heard kind words before. She had also learned what sometimes lived behind them. Lynn lifted her head slowly. Her green eyes, usually so soft, held the flat wariness of someone who had been disappointed too many times to afford hope easily. The man didn't rush them. He didn't explain himself with too many words or shift his weight with impatience. He simply stood there in the cold, hat in hand, watching them both with that steady hazel gaze that felt less like judgment and more like a kind of reckoning. "My name is Thomas Gable," he said. "I run Silverbrook Farm, about 2 hours east of here." He paused. "You can't keep sleeping on this bench. It wasn't pity in his voice. It was the flat acknowledgement of a man who had grown up in a world where pretending a hard thing wasn't hard cost too much in the end. Jenna straightened her back, even though every muscle protested. She lifted her chin slightly, the way she always did when she needed to appear stronger than she felt. "We don't have anywhere to go," she said. Her voice came out rougher than she intended. 5 days of cold and hunger had worn something thin in her throat. "But that doesn't mean we'll follow anyone who stops in front of us." Something moved behind Thomas's eyes. Not offense, almost something like respect. "Fair," he said. He crouched down to their level, not as condescension, but as a man trying to have a conversation rather than deliver a verdict. Up close, Jenna could see the deep lines around his eyes, the kind left by years of sun and loss and weather. "The farm needs workers. I can't pay in coin right now, but I can give you a roof, a warm place to sleep, and 3 meals a day." He met Jenna's eyes, then Lynn's. "That's the offer. Nothing more, nothing less." Lynn spoke for the first time in hours. Her voice came out thin, barely above the sound of the wind. "Why us?" The question hung between all 3 of them like smoke. Thomas was quiet for a moment. Then he stood back to his full height. "Because you're still sitting here," he said simply. He walked to a wagon parked a few feet away, loaded with winter supplies, and pulled a thick wool blanket from behind the seat. He brought it back and held it out to them, without fanfare. The sisters looked at each other. Jenna read her sister's face the way she had always been able to, the small tightening near the eyes, the barely there tremble at the corner of the mouth. Lynn was afraid. So was she. But fear had been their companion for so long now that it had almost stopped meaning anything useful. They had traded certainty for the street. They couldn't afford to trade the street for pride. Jenna nodded once. Lynn exhaled slowly and reached for the blanket. They climbed onto the wagon as the sky above Frost Creek turned the color of iron. Thomas clicked his tongue at the horses and turned them east without ceremony. The town fell away behind them, its bakery smell, its averted eyes, its cold, indifferent bench, and gave way to the white, open plains. Lynn pulled the blanket tight and pressed her shoulder against her sister's. Jenna watched the road disappear under the wheels and said nothing. She was trying to remember the last time someone had handed them something without asking what they'd give in return. She couldn't. The storm caught up with them 20 minutes outside of town. Snow came sideways now, driven by a wind that made the horses toss their heads and step sideways on the road. Thomas kept his eyes forward and his hands steady on the reins. He guided the team with the quiet confidence of a man who had navigated these plains in far worse conditions than this, who knew by instinct when to let the animals have their heads and when to hold firm. Jenna watched him from beneath the blanket. He didn't speak. He didn't glance back to check on them. He simply drove, present, unhurried, solid as the fence posts disappearing one by one under the snow. Lynn had fallen into a kind of half-sleep against Jenna's shoulder, not real sleep. The shallow, uncomfortable rest of a body that had long since crossed the line from tired into something deeper. Her lashes fluttered occasionally. Her breathing was slow and even but fragile, like something that might break if the cold got any worse. Jenna kept the blanket tucked around her sister's feet. She thought about their parents. She did that sometimes when the fear got too quiet to ignore, turned it toward memory instead, toward the small, specific details that grief never seemed to take. The way her father's beard smelled of wood smoke and the herbal soap her mother made in autumn. The sound of his voice, reading aloud from old land contracts by candlelight, not because he distrusted the men who handed them to him, but because he believed that a man who understood what he signed could never truly be cheated. He had been wrong about that. She pressed her thumb against the small lump beneath her dress. The broken green stone medallion split cleanly down the middle. Half of it was around her neck, the other half was around Lynn's. Their mother had given it to them the week before she died, pressing both pieces into their palms with hands that had already grown too light. "Wherever you two are," she had said, "you're still one thing." Jenna breathed in through her nose, breathed out slowly. The plains stretched out in every direction, white and vast and utterly indifferent to whether she fell apart or held together. She held together. Just before dark, the farmhouse appeared. It emerged from the snow the way certain things emerge from difficult years, not suddenly, not with fanfare, but slowly resolving out of the grey into something real and solid. A low-roofed building with warm light in one window. A barn. A split-rail fence running the perimeter, a stand of bare-branch cottonwoods along the north side, bent permanently by decades of wind. Thomas pulled the wagon up alongside the porch and set the brake. He came around to help them down without asking whether they needed it. Jenna's legs buckled slightly when her bare feet hit the snow-covered ground. The hunger and cold had taken more from her than she had admitted to herself. Thomas caught her elbow without making anything of it. He steadied Lynn's arm with his other hand until she found her footing. They went inside. The heat from the wood stove hit Jenna like something physical, a wave of warmth so sudden and complete after so many days of cold that her eyes stung with it. She stood just inside the doorway and didn't move for a moment. Lynn made a small sound beside her, not quite a sob, just the sound of a body remembering what safety felt like. Thomas moved to the stove and began preparing a meal without ceremony. Salted meat, beans, winter root vegetables, a simple stew that smelled, in that moment, like the finest thing either of them had ever encountered. The house was spare, few pieces of furniture, almost no decoration. A lived-in silence that had layers to it, not emptiness, but a space shaped over years by a person accustomed to being the only one in it. Jenna noticed a child's drawing pinned carefully to the wall beside the stove. She said nothing. She sat down at the rough wooden table and waited, and let herself be warm for the first time in 5 days. The storm lasted 2 more days. Snow sealed the farm in on all sides, blanketing the fields, drifting against the barn doors, turning the road back to Frost Creek into a white erasure. There was no going anywhere. The 3 of them, the rancher and the 2 sisters, settled into the strange intimacy of people sharing a small space through shared necessity. Thomas worked constantly. His hands were never still. In the mornings, he checked on the animals in the barn, breaking ice from the water troughs, spreading fresh hay, moving through the cold with the unhurried efficiency of a man whose body had long since made peace with hard labor. Afternoons he spent at the kitchen table repairing gear, mending broken harness leather, sharpening tools, splicing rope with the focused patience of someone using work the way other people used silence. Jenna watched him. She had developed the habit of observation long before hardship made it necessary. Her father had encouraged it, called it the first skill of any good mind. Watch how people move when they think no one is looking. That's where the truth lives. Thomas moved like a man carrying something heavy that he had learned to carry well. There was no bitterness in it, just the quiet forward momentum of someone who had decided that stopping wasn't an option. On the second afternoon, while Lynn napped in the small loft above and the storm rattled the window glass, Jenna came to the kitchen and found Thomas staring at something on the table. Not working, just staring. The child's drawing, the same one she had noticed pinned to the wall beside the stove the night they arrived. He had taken it down and placed it in front of him, as though he needed it closer. It was a simple thing, the kind made by very small hands. A house, a tree, 2 figures, a sun drawn with 8 bold strokes. Someone had written Papa at the bottom in uneven letters. Thomas looked up when he heard her. He folded the drawing carefully and tucked it away without embarrassment but also without explanation. Jenna turned to the stove to check the water kettle and gave him the grace of pretending she hadn't seen his eyes in that moment. She knew that look. She had worn it herself, standing in the doorway of her parents' empty house the morning after the fevers took her mother. By the 3rd morning, the sky cracked open and the storm withdrew. Thomas announced over breakfast that part of the herd might have drifted during the worst of the snowfall. Animals pressed south by wind and panic, potentially mired in the low draws at the edge of the south pasture. He was going out to check. Jenna said she was going with him. He looked at her for a long moment. Her hands were still thin from hunger, her colour only beginning to return. Lynn watched from the other side of the table with quiet attention. "The snow out there is deep," Thomas said. "Thigh-high in the drawers." "I know," Jenna said. "I'm still going." Something shifted in his expression. Not quite a smile. Something quieter. "Dress warm," he said. He found them heavy winter clothes from a chest near his bed, thick wool coats, long-handled underlayers, boots that were too big but far better than bare feet. Jenna pulled on the coat and felt the weight of it settle onto her shoulders like something borrowed from a larger life. She found a photograph tucked in the chest beneath the folded clothes. A woman, auburn hair, warm smile. A little girl, no older than 5, with her father's hazel eyes and a gap-toothed grin. Jenna put it back exactly as she found it. She buttoned the coat to the collar, went outside, and breathed the cold air in deep. She was ready to work. The south pasture was worse than Thomas had predicted. The drawers, the low channels carved into the land by decades of seasonal runoff, had filled with wind-packed snow to a depth that swallowed the legs entirely. Moving through it was slow and exhausting work, each step a negotiation with weight and cold. Thomas broke the path ahead of them, his broad shoulders cutting through the drifts, while the sisters followed in the channel he made. They found the first group of cattle huddled in a stand of scrub oak at the far edge of the property. 6 animals, cold and frightened but alive, their breath rising in clouds above the snow. Thomas showed Jenna how to read the way they'd moved, the direction of displaced snow, the shallow bowl where a body had rested and risen. She paid close attention, filed every detail. Lynn, meanwhile, had gone ahead to where 2 horses had wandered and become separated from the barn. Both animals were nervous, stamping, rolling their eyes, tossing their heads at the approach of strangers. Thomas took a careful step forward, and the younger horse backed up sharply. Lynn walked around him. She moved slowly, without urgency, her body low and relaxed. She held out one hand, palm up, fingers slightly curled, and made a soft sound in the back of her throat, not words, just tone. The horse lifted its head, its ears rotated forward. Lynn took another step, then another. The horse watched her, motionless now, as if it had simply decided to wait and see. She reached it, rested her palm on its jaw. The horse blew a slow breath against her coat and was still. Thomas stood watching with his arms at his sides. "How long has she been able to do that?" he asked. "Always," Jenna said. By mid-afternoon they had found 11 animals and guided them back toward the barn. It was hard, slow, cold work. Nothing elegant about it, nothing romantic. Just effort, repeated. But something had changed in the air between the 3 of them. The distance of strangers had begun, quietly, to close. That evening, Vivian Ashcroft appeared at the fence line. She rode a grey mare with expensive tack and sat in the saddle with the deliberate posture of a woman accustomed to being observed. Her silver-blonde hair was arranged neatly beneath her riding hat. She was 54 years old and had never in her life been spoken to the wrong way without consequence. Thomas's expression hardened the moment he saw her. Vivian rode the fence slowly, then stopped at the gate and looked down at all 3 of them with her pale blue eyes, moving between the sisters with a quality that had nothing to do with curiosity. "Thomas," she said pleasantly. "Quite the winter." "Vivian." Her gaze settled on Jenna, then Lynn. She took her time. "I heard you'd taken on some help." She let a pause do the work. Words would have been too obvious for. "The whole town is talking about it, you know. People find it unusual. People find anything unusual they don't understand," Thomas said. Vivian smiled with her mouth only. "I only mean to say, a man alone with 2 young orc girls on a remote property. There are those who wonder about the arrangement." Lynn looked at the ground. Jenna felt the heat rise in her chest, the way it always did when someone said what they really meant while pretending to say something else. Thomas stepped to the fence. "These women work my land honestly," he said. "That's the arrangement. Anyone who wonders differently is welcome to wonder from a great distance." Vivian's smile cooled. She held his gaze for one deliberate moment, then turned her horse back toward the road. "Do take care," she said, without looking back. The sound of hoofbeats faded. The three of them stood in the white silence of the field and didn't speak for a moment. Then Jenna said quietly, "She'll cause problems." "She already has," Thomas said, "and she'll try again." He turned back toward the barn without further comment, and after a beat, the sisters followed. That night the fire burned low and nobody moved to add a log. There was something in the quality of the silence, not uncomfortable but weighted, as if the house itself was waiting for something to finally be said. Lynn had fallen asleep in the chair nearest the stove, her loose hair falling across her shoulder, one hand tucked under her cheek. She slept the deep sleep of a body finally surrendering to rest it had been denying itself for too long. Jenna sat at the table with a cup of tea going cold in her hands. Thomas sat across from her. For a long time he looked at the grain of the wood table rather than at her. Then he began to speak. He had a wife, he said. Her name was Clara. She had auburn hair and green eyes and a habit of laughing at her own jokes before she finished telling them. They had a daughter named Rosie, 5 years old, gap-toothed, who drew pictures of the farm with 8-stroked suns and left them in his coat pockets for him to find during the day. He said their names carefully, the way a man handles something that has been broken. A fever came through the Plains settlements 12 years ago. It moved fast and it moved quietly, the way the worst things did. Clara went first. Rosie 3 days later. Thomas had stayed at their bedsides for both, had spoken every word he could think of, and then had run out of words and simply held their hands until the hands went still. He had been living in the resulting silence ever since. "When I saw you on that bench," he said slowly, "I didn't think about it. I just stopped." He paused. Rosie would have been 23 this spring. Jenna set down her cup. She reached into the collar of her dress and drew out the half-medallion on its cord, the green stone split clean down the center. She held it in her open palm for a moment, then set it on the table between them. "My parents came to Ashen Plains 28 years ago," she said. She told him everything. Her father, honest, hard-working, trusted, who had built a small property from nothing and believed in contracts because he believed in fairness. Her mother, who worked beside him every season, the life they built, the fevers that took them both within a year of each other. And then Gratha Vex. He had appeared like rot appearing in a wall, quiet at first, then suddenly everywhere. Documents, debts, claims against her father's estate that seemed to multiply every time the sisters tried to address them. Contracts with altered clauses, numbers that didn't reconcile. An orc merchant who wore expensive coats and gold rings and spoke the language of legal obligation like a weapon. Their uncle Garruk had been the only one to see it clearly. He had pressed his savings into their hands one evening and told them to run before Grathor came back. He had looked at Jenna and Lynn with amber eyes full of a grief he couldn't fix. "Go," he had said, "and don't look back." They had gone, through 3 small towns, then 2 more. Until Frost Creek and the bench and 5 days without food, and a man in a wool coat who stopped when no one else would. Thomas listened to all of it without moving. When she finished, the fire had gone to embers. The room was very quiet. "He's still looking for you," Thomas said. It wasn't a question. "Yes," Jenna said. "I think he is." Thomas was quiet for another moment. Then he got up, added 2 logs to the fire, and said, "Get some sleep." Jenna watched the flames catch. She understood that he hadn't offered her comfort or promises. He had given her something more practical, warmth, and the unspoken suggestion that morning was worth arriving at. She went to the loft and lay down beside her sleeping sister and stared at the ceiling until her eyes finally closed. Weeks passed. The world outside the farm remained cold and closed, but inside Silverbrook something had quietly shifted. Lynn had taken over the care of the horses fully now. There were 6 of them. 2 draft animals, 2 quarter horses, and a pair of young mares that had been poorly handled before Thomas acquired them. Under Lynn's attention, the nervous mares settled. She developed a daily routine that the animals anticipated before she arrived, pressing their heads over the stall doors when they heard her boots on the barn floor. A neighboring rancher passing through one afternoon watched her work for 5 minutes and offered Thomas twice the going rate for her services in training his own herd. Thomas declined on her behalf, but he told Lynn about the offer that evening. It was the first time either of them had seen her smile fully. Jenna had moved into the accounts and supply management of the farm with the same quiet intensity she brought to everything. She found 3 places where money had been leaking unnoticed for years: overcharges from a feed supplier, a miscalculation in the winter grain estimate, a recurring expense for a service that had stopped being rendered seasons ago. She corrected all 3, drafted clean records, and showed Thomas what she'd done. He looked at the ledger for a long time. "Where did you learn this?" he asked. "My father," she said. "He liked to teach us things he thought we'd need." She paused. He was right. The 3 of them had fallen into the rhythm of a household without quite deciding to. Meals together, work divided without needing to be negotiated. The evenings quieter now, in a different way, not the silence of loneliness, but the silence of people who had stopped performing ease and simply found it. Thomas had begun talking more, not about large things, just the daily observations of a man who had been keeping them to himself for too long. The way the light changed on the south pasture in late afternoon, which of the draft horses favoured his left shoulder on steep grades, the way the cottonwoods along the north fence sounded different in wind from the east versus wind from the west. Jenna noticed that he was starting to sound like himself. Then the carriage came. It appeared at the end of the farm road on a Thursday morning, black-lacquered, well-maintained, drawn by 2 dark bays that were too fine for a working vehicle. Jenna was in the barn and saw it first through the gap between the doors. She knew it before the driver climbed down. She knew it in the specific way the body knows certain things before the mind has finished processing, a cold that started behind the sternum and radiated outward, a sudden quiet in the ears. She walked to the house. Thomas met her in the doorway. He had seen the carriage too. A man in a charcoal coat climbed the porch steps with the smooth, unhurried movement of someone confident in their authority. He was perhaps 40, clean-shaven, carrying a leather document case. "I'm looking for Jenna and Lynn," he said. Thomas stepped into the doorframe. "And you are?" "An agent of Grather Vex." The man opened the case with practiced efficiency. "I've been searching for some time. I've located them here by reliable accounts." He produced a document and held it forward. "This is a claim of outstanding contractual obligation." Jenna appeared in the hallway behind Thomas. The agent looked at her over Thomas's shoulder with flat, professional eyes. "We can do this without difficulty," he said, "if you come willingly." Thomas took the document and read it slowly. His expression did not change. "Come back in 3 days," he said. The agent smiled thinly. "I'll return with a marshal and a territorial order." He replaced the papers in his case, descended the steps, and climbed back into the carriage. Jenna stood in the hallway and listened to the wheels leaving. Behind her, Lynn stood at the top of the loft steps, her face white beneath the green of her skin. Thomas turned from the doorway and looked at both of them. "Sit down," he said quietly. "We have work to do." The documents spread across the table like evidence of something long planned. Thomas had pulled out every legal reference he owned, a battered copy of the territorial land codes, a pamphlet of commercial regulations printed by the Blackstone Circuit Court, several years of correspondence he had saved from disputes over grazing rights and water access. He laid them all out without ceremony and sat down. Lynn, to everyone's quiet surprise, reached for the ledger copies first. "Tell me the numbers he used," she said to Jenna. "The original debt, every amount he added, in order." Jenna recited them from memory. She had run those figures through her mind so many times they were worn smooth. Lynn wrote them in a column and went still for a moment looking at the sequence. Then she started adding marks beside them, cross-references, recurring intervals. "This charge," she said, pointing to a figure in the middle. "It appears 3 times, but the dates are impossible. Look, this one was before your father took out the original loan. It predates the contract by 4 months." Jenna leaned in. "He invented a debt that existed before the debt," she said slowly. "Yes," Lynn said, "and if you trace this figure through the other charges—" She drew lines between them. "They're all multiples of the same base number. He didn't invent different debts. He invented one debt and reflected it through different documents to make it look like many." Thomas looked at the diagram she had made and was quiet for a moment. "That's fraud," he said. "That's always been fraud," Jenna said, and there was something in her voice that was older than anger. "We just couldn't prove it." "You need someone who can prove it officially," Thomas said. He sat back and was quiet for a moment, thinking. Then he stood, put on his coat, and went to the barn. He saddled the faster of the 2-quarter horses and rode back to Frost Creek through the late afternoon cold, where the telegraph office closed at sundown. He composed a message carefully, addressed to a circuit judge in Blackstone. He had assisted in a water dispute 3 years prior, a man of methodical integrity who believed that the law meant what it said. He described the situation plainly. He listed the fraudulent patterns Lynn had identified. He attached a copy of the most obviously falsified document. He sent the message and rode home. That night, none of them slept well. Jenna lay in the dark and listened to the wind moving over the roof and thought about Garrick, her father's brother, somewhere back in the settlements east of Frost Creek, who had given them everything he had and asked only that they get far enough away. She hoped he was still well. She hoped he knew they were still fighting. Lynn lay beside her, breathing evenly but awake. Jenna could tell by the rhythm. "What if it doesn't come in time?" Lynn asked. "Then we face it anyway," Jenna said. A long pause. "And Thomas?" Lynn asked. Jenna thought about the ledger he had opened without hesitation, the coat he had handed them without expectation, the way he had read the fraudulent document that afternoon and looked up at them both with something in his eyes that was not pity and not calculation, something older than either, something that looked simply like refusal. "He's not leaving," Jenna said. The next 2 days passed slowly and fast at once. The farm work continued. There was no suspending necessity for fear. Lynn tended her horses. Jenna reorganized the supply room and tried to keep her hands moving. Thomas worked the way he always worked, steady and present, and said little. On the morning of the 3rd day, they were all awake before dawn. They ate breakfast in silence. Through the window, the sky above Ashen Plains turned from black to grey, to the pale, uncertain colour of an early winter morning. Then the sound of wheels on the frozen road. 2 carriages. Thomas stood first. He walked to the door and opened it and stepped onto the porch. Jenna and Lynn came to stand behind him in the doorway, side by side, the half-medallions against their chests. The first carriage was black-lacquered. From it descended Gratha Vex. He was exactly as Jenna remembered. Dark olive skin, black hair slicked back, thick brow, gold rings on every finger. He wore an expensive coat and the expression of a man who had already decided how this would end. Beside him, his agent. Behind him, 3 other men. From the second carriage descended a territorial marshal, badge visible, documents in hand. And from the tree line at the edge of the road, Vivian Ashcroft observed on horseback, her ice-blue eyes taking in the scene with undisguised satisfaction. Gratha walked up the path toward the porch. "I'll make this simple," he said. "I have a marshal and a signed order. Hand them over now, and there won't be further trouble." Thomas stood at the edge of the porch and said nothing. Gratha looked at the sisters over his shoulder. "You've caused a great deal of inconvenience," he said to Jenna pleasantly, "but it ends here." Jenna stepped forward beside Thomas. She looked at Gratha Vex, at the rings, the coat, the face of a man who had taken everything her family built. and she felt something she hadn't expected to feel. Not terror, something cleaner than that. "My father trusted people," she said. Her voice was steady. "He believed that honest work and honest contracts meant something. You took advantage of that. You took his land and his name and left his daughters starving on a bench in the snow." She held his gaze. But he was right. Honest work does mean something, and what you built on lies is about to come apart. Grathor's pleasant expression flickered. From the road, the sound of hoofbeats. A single rider, moving fast. The rider came from the east, from the direction of Frost Creek, at a gallop, the horse's breath clouding behind it in the frozen air. He pulled up short of the gathering with the practiced stop of a dispatch rider, swung down, and walked directly to the marshal. He carried a folded telegram. Everyone watched. Nobody spoke. The marshal opened the message. He read it once. Then he read it again more slowly. Something changed in his expression. Not dramatically, not with theatre, but with the small, precise shift of a man who has just had the ground rearranged beneath his feet and is carefully deciding what to do next. He looked up at Grathor Vex. "This is from the Blackstone Circuit Court," he said. "It concerns you." Grathor's composure was extraordinary. Even now his face remained controlled, patient, the mask of a man accustomed to being the one with leverage. "I assure you," he began. 14 properties, the marshal said. "Over 11 years, fraudulent debt instruments, forged signatures, fabricated contract dates." He lowered the paper. "Your operation has been under investigation since last spring. Multiple complaints from 3 settlements were consolidated in Blackstone 2 months ago. The investigators had the evidence, but they were missing Vex's current location. The telegram received 3 days ago provided exactly that, along with documentation of a fresh instance of fraud. This message confirms that the investigation is now complete and warrants have been issued." A silence fell over the farm road that had a texture to it. The silence of a thing that has been turning for a long time, finally stopping. Grathor's agent took a small step back. One of the other men looked at the ground. Grathor himself was still. The rings caught the pale winter light. His jaw moved once, as if testing the weight of words he hadn't yet chosen. "These are fabrications," he said finally. "Politically motivated." 2 witnesses signed affidavits, the marshal said, including a notary in Sage Creek who confirmed he was paid to authenticate falsified documents. He folded the telegram and put it in his coat. "The order from Frost Creek is suspended. The arrest order from Blackstone stands." He nodded to his deputy. Grathor looked at Jenna. For just a moment, one unguarded second, his composure fell away, and what was underneath wasn't cruelty. It was the smaller and uglier thing that cruelty usually covers: desperation. The expression of a man who had believed that systems could be made to serve him forever, and was only now understanding that they couldn't. Jenna held his gaze until he looked away. The deputy moved to Grathor's side. He went quietly. There was no dramatic resistance in him, only the flat resignation of someone who had known, somewhere beneath the confidence, that this day existed. He was placed in the second carriage. The door closed. Vivian Ashcroft had not moved from her position at the tree line. She sat very still on her grey mare, watching. Then, without a word to anyone, she turned her horse and rode away down the frost-pale road. She didn't look back. The marshal spoke briefly with Thomas, confirming identities, noting the farm's address for court records, explaining that Jenna and Lynn would be contacted by the circuit clerk in Blackstone to formalize the dissolution of all fraudulent claims. The property their father had built would need to be processed through restitution proceedings, but the marshal was direct. The case was clear. He also mentioned, almost in passing, that the Blackstone investigators had already reached out to other victims named in the case. One of them, an older orc man in a settlement east of Frost Creek, had been among the first to send a statement. Jenna went very still. "His name," she said. The marshal checked his notes. Garrick, listed as a material witness. Jenna closed her eyes for just a moment. He was alive. He had found his own way to fight. Then everyone left, and the road was empty. The three of them stood on the porch for a while without speaking. The cold was still there. It was still January in Ashen Plains, and January didn't change because a carriage had driven away. The cottonwoods bent in the north wind. Somewhere in the barn, one of the horses stamped and blew. Lynn sat down on the top porch step. She pressed her hands together between her knees and let out a long breath that she seemed to have been holding since autumn. Jenna stood beside her. She reached up and held the half-medallion through the fabric of her coat. She thought about her father at the kitchen table, with his candlelight and his contracts. She thought about her mother's hands pressing the broken stone into their palms. Wherever you two are, you're still one thing. She thought about 5 days of hunger and the bench in the cold, and the man who had stopped when no one else would. Thomas sat down on the top step beside Lynn. He rested his forearms on his knees and looked out at the white fields of Silver Brook Farm, at the fence lines, the barn, the stand of cottonwoods, the south pasture where they had walked together through thigh-deep snow to bring lost animals home. After a while, Lynn leaned her head against his shoulder. He didn't move or speak. He simply let her. Jenna sat down on his other side. The three of them watched the light change on the snow, the pale winter blue of morning giving way slowly to the warmer tones of midday. Somewhere above the clouds, the sun was still there, working. The kind of thing that kept doing its work regardless. No one spoke for a long time. There was no need to. The hunger was gone. The running was finished. The lie that had chased them across 3 settlements and a season of cold had been put down at last, not by violence or luck, but by the patient work of 3 people who had kept going when stopping would have been easier. The farm was still standing. It smelled of wood smoke and horses and frozen earth, the smell of a place that had weathered things before and intended to weather more. Thomas reached into his coat pocket and pulled out the small folded drawing, the house, the tree, the 8-stroked sun. He unfolded it carefully and looked at it for a moment. Then he folded it again and put it back close to his chest. A door had not closed. It had simply opened into something larger. Jenna pulled her half-medallion from beneath her coat and held it in her open palm. Beside her, Lynn did the same. The 2 pieces of green stone sat there in the winter light. Split, but not lost. Separate, but still the same thing. The wind moved through the cottonwoods with a sound like water. Silver Brook Farm was quiet, and it was full. Did you enjoy the story? Subscribe to the channel to watch more stories like this one. Leave a like, it helps the channel a lot. And drop a comment down below. I always read them and use your feedback to make our content better. Thanks so much. Orc-Bound Legacy.